The background to this actually is that fairly recently, about 2 years ago, I started teaching preclinical medicine. And the result of it was I went back to the books, and one of the subjects which I was teaching last year was heart. And so we deal with things like the pharmacology, the physiology, anatomy, and so on and so forth. And I had this peculiar pleasure of having, it just the way it happened, the brightest of the medical students, which really put me on full stretch, made me realize I had to know a lot more than what I thought I knew. And the result was I had quite an in-depth look at it. And I have to say that one of the advantages of looking at it when you're an older person is you tend to see the wood rather than the trees. And when I was looking at various aspects of it, this is literally true, I was sitting there saying, do you know, that deserves a design award? That is just so clever. That is just so neat. And this is what I'd like to bring to you tonight. I'm bringing 4 aspects which really made me sit up and say, I really cannot buy that this is chance. It just fits so too well together. And I'm dealing with fairly large, superficial things, because some of the stuff which I was really amazed by, of course, was cell biology in the heart. And I would point out that when Darwin came out with his idea, at that time they thought that the cell was just a jelly. They had no concept whatsoever of how incredibly complicated it was. And you might think that the more that you understand how the human body works, then the more you would regard it as a machine. But if you were to look at a very complicated mechanism of some kind of watch and see how incredibly complicated it is, it makes you admire the person who made it. And that is my reaction when I look at, even right down to the level of cell biology. It makes me admire the creator, because to me it is just so, we are so fearfully and wonderfully made. Now, the subjects which I'm going to deal with are what happens when you run for a bus. Now, I'm very much aware that a certain percentage of the audience have never done biology, probably not even at school. And so I'd like to present it at a level that you will appreciate it. Because I've been on the receiving end of a lecture which I didn't understand a word of what was said, and I don't get anything out of that. So I think by the end of tonight, you will have understood, I would hope, all of it, but certainly most of it. So the first one is in yellow is the sort of title that would appear in the Daily Record and such like, right? Whereas in the white, it's for any physiologists that's among you. Now, I'm not a specialist in physiology, so I have every sympathy for those of you who don't know much about physiology. So this is what happens when you run for a bus. Then I want to speak about the heart as a pump, and the concept that it's actually 2 separate pumps that work side by side. And things can go wrong when one side has to pump harder than the other. And there's a very cunning mechanism in the heart that solves that problem almost instantly. And this is why I call it something up the sleeve. It's just something, as it were, it plays the ace of cards, and suddenly everything is hunky-dory. And the physiologists call this the Frank Starling mechanism. And it's named after the 2 chaps who actually discovered this, and it's not terribly long ago that this happened. I then want to talk about what happens when you really have to get the heart to contract harder. And although heart muscle is muscle, it behaves in quite a different way to the muscles of our skeleton, like, you know, the old biceps. And I'd like to go into detail about that. And finally, I'd want to speak about a fundamental difference between heart and skeletal muscle. And this is that the heart has to contract, relax, contract, relax, contract, relax, and has to do that all the time. Whereas sometimes when you're dealing with your old biceps, when you're carrying shopping, you don't want it to contract, relax, contract, relax. You've got to have it contracted all the time, okay? And I think it's really clever how it actually does that, so I want to speak about that as well. Now, I'm not going to go into the level of cell biology, because I find that even with the medical students, most of them can't handle it. They really it's not their favourite subject, so you tend to sort of not go into too great detail. Okay, so breathing deeply. So the scenario is, if you don't have a car and you're late and you're seeing the bus coming down the road and you're about 150 yards from the bus stop and you've got to do your 100-metre sprint in a matter of seconds, And I'm sure you've had the experience where you do indeed breathe deeply. Right? And actually that works wonders. And I'd like to explain a little bit about it. Now this is the chest. And I think actually okay. Now in the chest we have important structures. We have the lungs. Now I can actually use the wee mouse here if I'm clever enough. Yep, there's a wee mouse. So we have the right lung on this side. Now remember that you're looking at the person from the front. So your left is their right. And that might seem a small point to you, but that's why surgeons take off the wrong leg. Because if they get your right is their left. Okay? So that's his right lung. Can we get the view there? There's the right lung, and of course you've got the left lung on the other side. And in the centre, and to the left-hand side, of course, you've got the heart. Then you can see, well, this wee mouse wouldn't disappear. Come on. I'm going to give up the mouse, he doesn't watch it. There we have the major artery, which is the aorta, and the branches of the artery. And then in the blue, we have the veins. Now, of course, when you're supplying muscle with blood, it actually comes from the artery. So blood flows from the heart via the artery to, in this particular case, the biceps muscle. And then it flows back from the muscle to the heart via a vein. Now, I very deliberately made the vein flow back more slowly than the artery, because that's exactly what it is like in real life. And the reason for that is that the artery blood gets squeezed by the heart into the artery, and the result is that the artery is under high pressure. So the heart squeezes, squirts the blood up into the artery, works its way through to the biceps muscle. And then the blood, after it's done what it has to do with the muscle, trickles back to the heart. There's nothing actually pumping blood from the muscle back to the heart. This is in the normal situation. So there are two completely different pressure situations. And to illustrate this rather graphically, here we have the side of a head. And what this is showing are the vessels, the blood vessels. In the blue are the veins, which of course are taking blood back to the heart, and the red, the blood vessels, the arteries, which the blood is coming from the heart. Now, I'm sure you've heard the expression, go for the jugular. Yeah. Now, the jugular is actually, if I can get my wee mouse, this is the jugular vein here, right? And let me tell you, it's a load of mince. Don't go for the jugular. Because what happens is you cut the jugular vein and the person bleeds slowly. No big deal, and it's fairly straightforward to stop the blood coming out. What you do is you go for the carotid artery. Because if you sever the carotid artery, you get right? Because it's getting the full force of the heart. And I delight to tell medical students this because it's sort of, they find this highly entertaining, as do the dentists and the anatomists. Unfortunately, I've not heard of any instance where they've actually tried it. Now, so that really illustrates the fact that the arteries are under a great pressure because of heart contracting, whereas the veins are under very little pressure and the blood is trickling back. Now, that created a problem for me. And the problem was this. I'm sure you're aware that when you're really exercising hard, you have to get a lot more blood to the muscles to supply them with the oxygen and the nutrients. And it's quite easy to do that. The heart just pumps harder. That's great. But how do you get the blood back from the muscle to the heart quick enough to keep the heart fed with blood so it can pump it more quickly? And this is the problem that I had. And this is where we come into the world of the respiratory pump. Now, chest cavity, as I said, contains the lung and the heart, and the abdominal cavity contains all the guts, your stomach and your liver and your kidneys and all that sort of stuff. Whenever I dissect the abdominal cavity, I do not have sausages and gravy for lunch. It's just too reminiscent of what I've been up to. I don't want you to put off sausages and gravy. Now, the black line which I've drawn there is actually a sort of a representation of the muscle that is the principal muscle involved in breathing, and this is the diaphragm. And the way that actually works is that the diaphragm moves down the way, and as it does so, you can see that the chest cavity expands. Now, because the chest cavity expands, you're creating a sort of a partial vacuum, if you like, a negative pressure. And it's this vacuum in the chest cavity that sucks air in through the nose into your lungs. Okay? And of course, when the diaphragm relaxes and goes back up again, You're squeezing the cavity, and it's this squeezing of the cavity that gets the air back out of your lungs into the atmosphere. Now, the other thing I would like you to notice is that when you breathe in, you're squeezing your abdominal cavity, okay? And you might want to sit there and breathe in deeply and put your hands on your stomach, and you realize that you breathe in deeply, your stomach actually expands a bit because your guts are getting crushed. Now, this is where I find it interesting. Blood coming from the legs, which of course is a big source of where the blood goes to, particularly when you're running for a bus, because most people use their legs to run. That's a wee joke. Travels up through the abdomen, into the chest cavity, and back to the heart. Now, when you breathe in, you create this partial vacuum in your chest cavity, and you actually suck blood up your veins into your chest. Okay? And of course, at the same time as breathing in, you're pushing your abdomen down, and you're squeezing the blood in your abdominal cavity into the chest cavity. It's a little bit like squeezing a toothpaste tube. Don't try it, it's a bit messy. Now, I find it is really neat that the harder you exercise, the more this system kicks into gear. And it works in beautiful synchrony, so that when you're relaxed, there's very little of this happening at all. And you're basically relying upon the normal venous pressure to get your blood back to the heart. But as soon as you start doing heavy exercise, and the heavier the exercise, the more this effect has. And I sat back and I thought, you know, that really is rather neat. And that's a very general, superficial example of what I mean when things fit together so nicely. And you say, I find this hard to believe that it's just a pure chance random mutation. It just fits together so well. Now, still speaking about respiratory pump, but moving down to the legs, there's another aspect which I found rather interesting. And this is called the calf pump. Now, of course, calf is referring not to a baby cow, but to the back of the leg. Now, this is a leg of a negroid or a black man. You may wonder why on earth are we showing a black man. Well, I don't know if you've ever noticed that generally speaking, black people have much more better developed muscles than white people, generally speaking. And so if we ever get one on our dissection table, it's a delight because, you know, there's much more to show. I have a different way of looking at people. I just imagine, wouldn't mind having you in this lab. So get worried. Now, an anatomist, when he talks about a leg, he actually refers to the bit between the knee joint at the top, right, and the ankle joint at the bottom. Whereas when you refer to a leg, I'm sure you mean basically the whole of what we would call a lower limb. And the bit which I'm particularly interested in is this bulge in the leg at the back. Now, this bulge is principally formed by a muscle which is called gastrocnemius. And you can forget that word as quickly as I said it because it's got no relevance to what I'd like to say. But when you look at a dissection of the leg, and this is the same, not exactly the same leg, but the same area of the leg, the gastrocnemius has actually been removed. Oh, my wee mousey, mousey. Right, I think I'm going to stop using the mouse. I'll forget that. Do you have a laser pointer like that? No? Okay. Right, okay. I will use my wee mousey then. He's going to have to behave himself. Right, there he is there. And there's a muscle underneath the gastrocnemius which is called the soleus muscle, which you can so as you've seen I showed you there. Now, that muscle is called the heart of the leg. Not because it's in the center of the leg, but because it's greatly involved in pumping blood from the veins in the leg back up towards the heart. And it's called the soleus. Well, we don't really know why it's called the soleus. Some people say it's because it's shaped like a flat fish, the sole. And other people say, well, it's because it's connected to the sole of the foot. So the jury's out on that one. But the point is, it has very large diameter veins within it. And when the muscle contracts, it squeezes the veins. Now, one of the interesting things I find about the soleus is that if you build a plaster model of a person, an exact replica, and you stand him on his feet, no sooner have you stood him and he'll fall on his nose. And he'll always fall on his nose because the center of gravity is slightly in front of your ankle joints, so you're liable to fall over. And this muscle spends the time correcting this change in gravity, just brings you back a wee bit, and it does it all the time. So it's a muscle which is continually working. And this is why you have the problem of guardsmen on duty. If they're too rigid at attention, that muscle is not contracting, and the result is they faint. And the reason for that is that it's only when the muscle contracts that you really get the blood that pools in the legs. You get it forced back up towards the heart. So that's very, very important to keep your muscle contracting. And of course, they're actually taught to move that muscle continuously without actually letting on that their legs are moving. There's an art to that. Now, I'd like to explain the kappa in a wee bit more detail. Now, this is a diagram which is, it's just a diagram. It's not accurate. It's just showing a principle. And what you've got to imagine is that you've got a vein in blue running between two muscles. In fact, we're really talking about a vein running within a muscle, but that's being pedantic. And the blood, of course, in the vein is flowing from the foot, the lower leg, up towards the heart. And what happens when you contract a muscle is that you squeeze the vein between the muscle. And in squeezing the vein, you're pushing blood further up towards the heart. Now, the system is so designed that you have valves below the muscle that prevent the blood going back down into the foot. Okay? And then, when you relax the muscle, blood continues to flow up towards the heart. But what does not happen, which could happen, is that the blood starts to drain back down into the legs. So in other words, you pushed up the vein, and when you let the muscle go, it just goes zoom, down again. But it doesn't happen because, again, you've got a valve above the vein, above the muscle, that prevents this backflow. So I think that's rather a neat system. And I see this all the time when we do dissections, how incredibly neat things are. And it makes me wonder. It makes me wonder. You're not just a slab of meat. You're actually incredibly ingeniously made. Now, whilst I speak about the kappa pump, one has to mention deep vein thrombosis, simply because it's always, well, it's been in the news quite a lot. I'm sure you remember a few years ago the case of a sports girl who travelled by plane from Britain to Australia, and 24 hours later she was dead in her bed. And this is because she had deep vein thrombosis. I always joke when we talk about the vein from the brain, we say it's a vein that drains the brain, and the students get tripped up on that one. But in deep vein thrombosis, basically what happens is that the calf muscle does not contract on a regular basis, and the blood begins to pool in the legs. It doesn't move about. Now, when blood doesn't pool in the legs, the problem is it will form clots. And the clot travels up the vein through the heart and lodges in the lungs, and causes what we classify a pulmonary embolism, which, if it's large enough, if the clot's large enough, will actually kill you very, very rapidly. And of course, you get smaller embolisms which do damage, and even smaller ones which sometimes are just simply you're not aware of until we actually dissect you, and then we discover there's little areas of your lungs which have obviously infarcted because the blood flow has been stopped to that area. So I just thought I'd drop that one in because, you know, deep vein thrombosis is always something which people are aware of. And of course, one of the things that happen is the particularly high risk group in this are people who've had an operation. And if you lie in your bed, and if you put pressure on your calf muscles because you're lying on your back, then you have a pretty good chance of developing it. And this is why the nurses get you out of your bed and get you walking about. It's not enough to sit in your seat, they get you walking about, because it basically almost eliminates the chances of having a deep vein thrombosis, because as you walk about, you're contracting the calf muscles in your leg. So, if you land up in the hospital with an operation, you be quick to get out of your bed as soon as you possibly can, because that improves your chances. It's not that nurses are sadistic. Well, maybe they are. Yeah, I must admit, I had appendicitis. I got my appendix removed, and the nurses took great delight in making me laugh, because I laughed and I cried in agony at the same time. So, Okay, so moving on to a second section, and this is where I said that the heart has got something pretty ingenious which it pulls out when it needs to. And in order to explain that, I think it would be good to explain the basic idea of how a heart works. So we have here a very, very simple diagram of the heart, and you've got two separate pumps involved here, and I'm going to do them one at a time initially. So you've got the pump on this side where blood is travelling back from the body through veins. They fill this upper chamber, and then the blood flows into the lower chamber, and then eventually gets squirted to the lungs when the heart muscle contracts. And the heart muscle is a large dark area you're seeing around the bottom of the heart. I should mention that the upper chamber we call the atrium and the lower chamber the ventricle, and we'll probably come back to that. So that is one pump that's working, where basically it's pumping blood from the body to the lungs. But you have another pump which is pumping blood from the lungs to the body, and it works in a very similar way. Fills up the atrium, flows into the ventricle contracts, and blood gets squeezed up to the body. So that's the two separate pumps, okay? Now, since we're talking about the heart, I thought you might appreciate seeing what a real heart actually looks like. Some of you will, some of you won't, probably. This is one of my own dissections. This was rescued from first-year medical students before they completely destroyed it. You see, we have this bizarre system in our department that the medical students get first chew of the body, and then those of us who want to prepare parts for teaching get the last chew, so we have to make do with the rubbish. So what we have here is, now remember, this is you looking at the patient the way we've looked at. You're looking at the front. So remember, your left is their right. So right-hand side, blood is flowing from the body into this chamber, which I cut a window in the chamber. This chamber we call the right atrium. Chamber fills up, and then blood flows from that chamber into the ventricle. And it's the ventricle which is a chamber that has the muscle round it. And of course, as the muscle squeezes, it pushes the blood, in this particular case, to the lungs. Okay? So you've got two chambers, and it's the lower one which actually does the pumping action. Now, there's one thing I would like to mention just out of pure interest for some of you, and that is that there are two valves involved here. We have this valve here. In this particular case, we call it the tricuspid valve. And this basically, what it does is that when the ventricle contracts, it stops blood being forced back into the atrium, because that would defeat the whole purpose. And then you have another valve here. In this particular case, it's called the pulmonary valve. And what this valve does is that when the ventricle relaxes, it stops blood flowing back into the ventricle from the lungs, because again, that defeats the purpose. And if you ever have the pleasure of nicking one of these stethoscopes and listening to somebody's heartbeats, you hear lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub. The lub is it's not actually the tricuspid valve, but it's the left ventricle is equivalent to the tricuspid valve closing, and the dub is the equivalent of this pulmonary valve closing. So you're just hearing the valves closing, lub-dub, lub-dub. And of course, one of the things which the doctor is wanting to do is he's wanting to hear any unusual signs that tell that a valve's not closing properly, or it's closing too quickly, and so on and so forth, and you get all sorts of diagnoses. So that's what a heart actually looks like in real life. And this was a good heart. Now, I'm from Glasgow, and the west of Scotland is famous for heart disease. And hearts get so large in the west of Scotland that we actually build houses inside them. It's an exaggeration, but you do get the point. I have actually had one case of a left ventricle being so large I could put my entire fist into the ventricle, when in fact the whole heart should be the size of your fist. So that gives you an idea. And one of the good things it does for our students is that they don't go back to McDonald's, hamburger bars, etc. and to see what these things happen. I'll probably get sued by McDonald's, but there you go. Now this is back to the diagram, and the next thing I'd like to point out about the heart is that although there are two separate pumps in the heart, they're working together. They're working at the same time, what we say in synchrony. So the blood flows in at the same time, it fills up the chambers at the same time, and it flows into the lower chambers at the same time, filling up the lower chambers, and then of course it flows back to wherever it's going to go, the body or the lungs. So they have to work in synchrony with each other. And this is absolutely essential for the thing to work properly. And it's this that made me sit back and go, that is ingenious. And what made me sit back and think about this was that you have a situation where sometimes more blood enters one side than the other. And you've got to very quickly correct that. Otherwise, you've got major problems with the others not getting enough blood into it, and you get all sorts of complications. And this can happen in life, particularly in disease. And probably the classic case is where you have disease of the lungs, where resistance builds up in the lungs to blood flowing through it. And the result is that the right-hand side has more difficulty in getting blood into it, and that produces a whole series of complications. Now, this is sort of shown in a sort of dramatic way, where you have an enormous amount of blood entering into one side, whereas you're not having the same volume of blood entering into the other side. And the question is, how does the heart instantaneously, automatically regulate itself in such a way that the overfilling of blood on one side is corrected so that you get back to a nice even balance? And this is what they talk about, the Frank-Starling mechanism. And I would like to explain how this works, because it's not intuitive. It's not something you would immediately realize is happening. And in order to do that, we have to look at muscle. Now, I have a friend of mine. This, by the way, is not my biceps. It's not an orangutan either. It's actually one of my friends who wishes to remain anonymous, and therefore his wishes are granted. Now, the reason why I'm showing you this is that somebody told me, do not assume that everybody knows that the way that most muscles work is they shorten. So when a muscle contracts, it actually shortens. And this is what this thing is about. You'll see the length of the muscle before. You can imagine if you draw a vertical line to where the biceps is, either end, and then you see what happens, the contraction of the muscle, and you'll notice how it shortens. You see that? And that's basically how a muscle works. It shortens. Now, that is not universally true. There are some muscles that simply tighten. They don't shorten. But generally, they shorten. And that is true of the heart muscle. That's the way it works. It shortens. Okay. Now, looking at it in a little bit more detail, this is half a chest cavity. Okay. Now, this is the center where the breastbone would be. No, don't get carried away. And then you see he's an awful sensitive keyboard. Okay. You can use your imagination that most of what you're seeing in the chest is the pectoralis major muscle. Now, in street parlance, they don't call it the pectoralis major. They call it the pecs. Right? You heard of the pecs. That's the pectoralis major muscle. It's just not of interest at the moment. But if you move over to your right-hand side, so if I can tell my right from my left, you'll see the part of the arm has been cut off just above the elbow. And where it's just been cut above the skin, you're seeing the biceps muscle, which we've been showing you in demonstration. Now, when you pile into your meat, of course, you're actually eating muscle, and this is a fragment of the bit that gets stuck between your teeth. Okay, so this is a fragment of a muscle. And what you're seeing is it's composed of fibers which are running horizontally from left to right. And the way the muscle works is that when it shortens, these fibers get shorter, so they're going like that. Okay? When you look in more detail at it, and notice I've got a little yellow square, or probably a rectangle down in the bottom right-hand side, which is shown at the maximum resolution pretty well of the light microscope. And what you're seeing is basically a dark band, a light band, a dark band, a light band. And then if you look carefully, you'll realize it's a very thin dark band in the middle of the light band. Okay? You look at it at even higher resolution, and this time you have to go to the transmission electron microscope. And what you're seeing is, not only do you have these vertical bands, but you see a whole lot of the horizontal bands. It's like a stack of plates. You see that? And the stack of plates contains what I will simply call a thick fiber. It's actually what they call myosin, for those of you who are in the know. And the myosin's partially surrounded by a very thin filament, which is called actin, and it's the thin filament that forms a light band between the dark bands. Okay. Now, I don't know if this mouse is going to behave himself. So this area, this whole width here is the light band. And remember, it's a very narrow, dark band in the middle of the light band. That's him there. And that's just basically where you're getting the crisscrosses of the actin filaments. Now, I'm going to show this yellow and red as a diagram because this is really the fundamental building block of the muscle, and this is how the muscle is actually able to shorten. And the way I just show it is here. So you've got the thin filament, this is actin, you've got a thick filament, this is myosin, and what happens is that when you contract a muscle, the thin filament slides over the thick filament, and you can see how it actually shortens. Now I've deliberately put the two arrows, one at either end, to show you the difference between a relaxed muscle and a contracted muscle. Okay, so this is him contracting again, and of course after having contracted at some point he's able to relax and he goes back to his original length. Now, to add a little bit more complication to this, there are little motors. Now I'm using the word motor in a sort of daily record type expression. Technically they call them cross bridges, and I don't want to go into the sort of the cell biological detail exactly what it is, but I'm representing it as a little cog, which is not strictly accurate, but it gives you the idea what's happening. And basically the little cog, as it turns, pulls the actin filament over the myosin filament, and it's the cogs that give the ability of the actin to slide over the myosin and to strength. Now, another thing I have to say is that if a muscle is relaxed, you can actually stretch it, okay? And if you suddenly let the muscle go again, it will return to its normal length. And I'll do a little demonstration of this. Now what I would like you to notice is that this is it unstretched. It's just passively lying like that. And notice in my diagram that for each actin filament I've got two of the cogs gripping the filament. Okay, that's what I want you to notice. And when you stretch it, the result is you only have one of the cogs gripping the filament. So basically what I'm saying is there's less grip between the thick filament and the thin filament when you passively stretch the muscle. And I'm sure you've had this experience, for example, when you take heavy shopping in your hands and your arms extended, and when you do this, it takes a lot of effort, but when you get roughly about halfway, it's dead easy, because basically there's more cogs interacting with the actin filaments when you do this, and this is when the muscle's at its strongest. Whereas when you do that, you're actually stretching it, and therefore not making it as strong. So I demonstrate this. So this is maximum strength at the top, the two arrows showing you what it is before you actually contract it. And we've done a demo. This is the thin filament. And notice that when you stretch it, what you're actually doing is that you've only got one cog gripping the actin filament, so that it's weaker when you start trying to pull the actin filament over the myosin filament. So that's why when you stretch a muscle, you actually make it weaker. Now, what's not quite so intuitive is that the opposite is also true, and that is if you push a muscle filaments together, you also make it weaker. Now, looking at that diagram, you say, well, wait a minute, that doesn't add up because you've got three cogs here, and three cogs are an awful lot better than one, and they're better than two. But what happens is that when you contract a muscle, the actin filaments begin to slide over each other, they interfere with the cogs, you see that? And not only that, the ends of the actin filaments bump into the thick red filament, and things don't work properly. So if for some reason, the muscle is crushed before it actually contracts, it's not as strong as if it's allowed to be in its relaxed normal state. Now it so happens, I use the word, so happens, that all skeletal muscle is at the point of where as soon as you contract it, you will get maximum strength. Okay? The heart muscle is quite different, and this made me sit up and think, wow. The heart muscle is actually crushed in its normal state, which means, of course, that the heart muscle is not operating at its full strength. It's operating at a disadvantage because it's crushed. But if you expand the chamber with more blood than normal, you stretch the heart muscle. And by stretching the heart muscle, you actually make it stronger. Okay? If I go back to the diagram, so that's it in the crush, just to show you that the problem of overlapping and so on and so forth. If I go back to the the diagram, you remember how I said that you had this massive problem of where the chamber gets stretched, overstretched, because there's too much blood going into it. And that automatically stretches the heart muscle. And by stretching it, it actually makes it stronger, not weaker. And therefore, instantaneously, you correct the problem between having too much blood in one chamber compared to the other. It's built into the heart. And I sit back and I say, I find that really clever, ingenious. And if somebody had actually designed that in the Toyota car factory, we'd all be giving them a design award. It's just a very, very clever concept. And bear in mind, I'm being very, very superficial. Well, not only this, we only know a tiny fraction of what is actually there. And our understanding is superficial. And there's much, much more to it than that. And every time you get into a deeper layer, again, you see how clever the whole thing is. And that, to me, is a proof of a maker. So, I think that's all I want to say about having something up the sleeve, this ability that if you overstretch the chamber, it automatically corrects things because the muscle gets stronger. Now, stepping the gas is about situations where you don't overstretch the chamber, but you do have to make the heart contract more powerfully because you're running for a bus. Okay? And now, why on earth I put this one back in here? I don't know, I can't remember. Anyway, we'll move on from there. Okay. So again, we're dealing with this little diagram of the yellow and the red representing the heart fibre, and you see how he fits into the whole thing. And notice that the diagram runs along the length of the stream. It's horizontal, and therefore the screen shortens as the thing contracts. And I did that very deliberately because that's exactly the way it does work. Now, this is the situation in skeletal muscle. When you send a nerve signal to the muscle to contract, one of the things that the nerve signal does is it causes calcium ions. Now, you know calcium as in calcium carbonate, chalk. Calcium ions flow from outside the muscle, or I should say outside the muscle fibre, into it. Now, the yellow box around the outside is a diagram indicating the limits of the actual muscle fibre. And calcium on the outside, when you get this nerve telling the muscle to contract, the calcium gets into the muscle, and the result is all the muscle fibres, all the little mechanisms contract. Now, in the case of skeletal muscle, it's an all or nothing response. So as soon as calcium enters into it, bang, you get the full contraction of the fibre. This is not the case in the heart. And I had to say, wow. In the heart, what happens is, if a small amount of calcium gets into the chamber, into the fibre, only a few of these mechanisms contract. And this is what happens in the normal. So as you're sitting quite relaxed in your seat, not straining your heart, there's only about probably a third or something like that of your heart muscle fibres which are actually contracting. You'll discover that I don't like using the word nature, but we'll just use it, nature, it conserves energy. We could do well with learning from nature that it never wastes any more fuel than what is absolutely necessary. And so in this situation, it would be a waste of energy having all the muscles contracting at the same time because you don't need it. However, if you allow more calcium to flow into the heart muscle than normal, you get more of the fibres contracting. Until you get to a level where there is so much calcium that enters the muscle fibre that the entire complement of mechanisms contract. So, fundamental difference between the heart and skeletal muscle is that a small amount of calcium in skeletal muscle and bang, the whole lot contracts. In the heart, the more calcium you add to it, the more powerful the contraction. So the heart has this ability to give the strength that is necessary to accomplish the job and no more than what is necessary, and therefore conserve energy, the use of energy. Now, of course, I'm sure you've had the situation where you have a fright and you feel this sudden adrenaline rush inside yourself. And I don't know if you've ever had the experience of where you're up during the night or you hear a bump during the night and you're out of your bed to explore, and your heart is beating so powerfully that it's sure that everybody in the entire building can hear it, brum, brum. And this is caused by adrenaline. And adrenaline acts upon channels, for the sake of the word, which allow more calcium to enter into the heart muscle and make the heart muscle contract more powerfully. And I don't want to go into it tonight, but there's a whole sort of cascade mechanism of one factor activating another factor and so on and so forth that causes all sorts of very, very interesting things to happen. For example, you have to get calcium out of the cell to stop this happening. And physiologists have known for quite a while that when the heart beats very rapidly, one thing that happens is it relaxes much more rapidly than normal. And it's only fairly recently we've discovered how it actually managed to do that. And again, there's another ingenious mechanism in that, but I don't want to go into that tonight. Okay, so that's what happens when you step on the gas. Now, this should actually be number 3. We did last-minute changes when I did a dummy run with somebody. Somebody who was not a biologist and said, no, wait. You've got to explain X, Y, and Z. So, in this situation, what I'm talking about is the fact that the heart, unlike other muscles, has to contract, relax all the time. And of course, on average, it's contracting, relaxing at 60 times a minute. This is why you have 60 heartbeats a minute. Now, the wavy line I'm showing here basically is the heart muscle contracting. So, the peak at the top is when it's contract, and the trough at the bottom is when it's relaxed. And you can see how it's going contracting, relaxing. Now, when it contracts, what it's actually doing is it's squeezing blood from the chamber into the arteries. And when it relaxes, it's allowing blood to flow into it from the veins. So you've got to have this contract, relax, contract, because squeeze, suck, squeeze the arteries, suck veins, and so on. And this is how you get the continual cycle like a pump. Now, skeletal muscle, as I've already indicated, you can do that. I mean, you can do that with your biceps. You get these people who sit in gyms and do this all the time. It's not one of the things I get involved with, fortunately. But there are certain situations where you don't really want to do that. For example, you don't want to carry your shopping like this. And I guarantee if you do this all the time with your shopping, you're not going to last very long because your muscles get very, very sore. You want to be able to hold for a long period of time. And I actually am amazed, not at my own body, but the human body in general, how it is we can carry enormously heavy weights and keep your fingers contracted and hold the weight. And you might take that for granted, but I am astonished that the body is able to do that. So in the case of skeletal muscle, you contract, and then you've got a long period of where you keep it contracted, and you only relax it when you dump your shopping on the table. Or if you've had too much, when you dump it on the pavement. Had that happen before. Now, if you have this situation where it's permanently, when it's contracted for a long period of time, if that happened in the heart, you would drop dead. So you've got to have some sort of inbuilt mechanism that makes absolutely sure that this never happens. Excuse me as I take this off. It's funny how talking actually makes you hot. So you've got to have a system built into the heart muscle that it will never be allowed to remain contracted for any period of time, because if that happens, there's no blood flow and there's death. And it was this system that made me think, wow. And I'd like to explain it to some degree. Now, this is, on the left-hand side, I show a skeletal muscle in red contracting. So, to show it a higher power, you have a period where it contracts to a peak and then it relaxes back to its normal state. And it's made to contract to a peak because the line in blue on the left-hand side is actually a nerve signal. A little blip in the nerve signal, which we call the action potential. And it's this little blip that causes the muscle to contract. And of course, you can see what happens is that the muscle contracts and then it relaxes. But if you get two blips close to each other, what happens is, if they're close enough, it doesn't relax, it contracts even more. Okay? If you get the nerve signals close enough to each other. And if you have a whole series of nerve signals that come close to each other, eventually what happens is it contracts, and it will remain contracted for as long as you keep sending it these signals. And that's why you consciously hold on to your shopping. Your brain is actually telling your muscle to remain contracted because it's sending these continuous signals to the muscle to remain contracted. Now, if that could happen in the heart, that would be disastrous. And they talk about refractory period, and what they mean is that if you send a signal through the nerve has a wee blip, and then the nerve relaxes. And there's a short period before the nerve can send another signal. It's got to have a rest before the next signal passes through it. And in the case of nerve supplying the muscle, the length of time it takes for the nerve to sort of recover itself is in the period of something like 2 to 3 milliseconds. So if you send a signal every 3 or 4 milliseconds, you'll get this muscle contracted all of the time without relaxing. But this is not the case in the heart. Fundamental difference is that this is the signal. This actually is not quite the nerve signal, but it's equivalent. It's actually the membrane of the heart muscle. And what you see is the blip causes a rise in the signal, but the signal takes a long time before he eventually goes back down to normal. And there's a very long period, and it's something of the order of 150 milliseconds before you can send another signal to tell the heart muscle to contract. And the heart is so designed that in that 150 milliseconds, it's contracted and it's relaxed. Is that not ingenious? So it can't get another signal until the muscle has relaxed. And that is how the heart avoids being contracted all the time. It's worked into the actual. It's all to do with the flow of ions through channels, etc., etc. And it's sort of, if you like, the hardware to make sure that the heart always relaxes before it gets its next signal to contract. And it's foolproof. I don't think there's ever been recorded cases where a heart has remained contracted for any length of period of time. You get other problems, of course. It contracts too rapidly. That's normally what the major problem is. And I thought that was ingenious. And that's the last example which I'd like to present to you of we are fearfully and wonderfully made. It fits together so neatly that I would suggest to you that it's evidence of a creator and not merely random chance by mutations. And I think that probably is it. Here in the Daily Record and such like, right? Whereas in the white, it's for any physiologists that's among you. Now, I'm not a specialist in physiology, so I have every sympathy for those of you who don't know much about physiology. So this is what happens when you run for a bus. Then I want to speak about the heart as a pump and the concept that it's actually two separate pumps that work side by side. And things can go wrong when one side has to pump harder than the other. And there's a very cunning mechanism in the heart that solves that problem almost instantly. And this is why I call it something up the sleeve. It's just something, as it were, it plays the ace of cards and suddenly everything is hunky-dory. And the physiologists call this the Frank Starling mechanism. And it's named after the two chaps who actually discovered this. And it's not terribly long ago that this happened. I then want to talk about what happens when you really have to get the heart to contract harder. And although heart muscle is muscle, it behaves in quite a different way to the muscles of our skeleton, like, the old biceps. And I'd like to go into detail about that. And finally, I'd want to speak about a fundamental difference between heart and skeletal muscle. And this is that the heart has to contract, relax, contract, relax, contract, relax, and has to do that all the time. Whereas sometimes when you're dealing with your old biceps, when you're carrying shopping, you don't want it to contract, relax, contract, relax. You've got to have it contracted all the time. Okay? And I think it's really clever how it actually does that, so I want to speak about that as well. Now, I'm not going to go into the level of cell biology because I find that even with the medical students, most of them can't handle it. They really it's not their favourite subject, so you tend to sort of not go into too great detail. Okay, so breathing deeply. So the scenario is, if you don't have a car and you're late and you're seeing the bus coming down the road and you're about 150 yards from the bus stop and you've got to do your 100-metre sprint in a matter of seconds. And I'm sure you've had the experience where you do indeed breathe deeply. Right? And actually that works wonders. And I'd like to explain a little bit about it. Now this is the chest. And I think okay. Now in the chest we have important structures. We have the lungs. Now I can actually use the wee mouse here if I'm clever enough. Yep, there's a wee mouse. So we have the right lung on this side. Now remember that you're looking at the person from the front. So your left is their right. And that might seem a small point to you. Some of the stuff which I was really amazed by, of course, was cell biology in the heart. And I would point out that when Darwin came out with his idea, at that time they thought that the cell was just a jelly. They had no concept whatsoever of how incredibly complicated it was. And you might think that the more that you understand how the human body works, then the more you would regard it as a machine. But if you were to look at a very complicated mechanism of some kind of watch and see how incredibly complicated it is, it makes you admire the person who made it. And that is my reaction when I look at, even right down to the level of cell biology. It makes me admire the creator, because to me it is just we are so fearfully and wonderfully made. Now the subjects which I'm going to deal with are what happens when you run for a bus. Now I'm very much aware that a certain percentage of the audience have never done biology, probably not even at school, and so I'd like to present it at a level that you will appreciate it. Because I've been on the receiving end of a lecture which I didn't understand a word what was said, and I don't get anything out of that. So I think by the end of tonight, you will have understood, I would hope, all of it, but certainly most of it. So the first one is in yellow is the sort of title that would appear, but that's why surgeons take off the wrong leg, because they forget your right is their left. Okay. So that's his right lung. Can we get the V there? There's the right lung, and of course you've got the left lung on the other side. And in the centre, and to the left-hand side, of course, you've got the heart. Then you can see, I wish this wee mouse wouldn't disappear. Come on, I'm going to give up the mouse so he doesn't watch it. There we have the major artery, which is the aorta, and the branches of the artery. And then in the blue, we have the veins. Now, of course, when you're supplying muscle with blood, it actually comes from the artery. So blood flows from the heart via the artery to, in this particular case, the biceps muscle. And then it flows back from the muscle to the heart via a vein. Now, I very deliberately made the vein flow back more slowly than the artery, because that's exactly what it is like in real life. And the reason for that is that the artery blood gets squeezed by the heart into the artery, and the result is that the artery is under high pressure. So the heart squeezes, squirts the blood up into the artery, works its way through to the biceps muscle. And then the blood, after it's done what it has to do with the muscle, trickles back to the heart. There's nothing actually pumping blood from the muscle back to the heart. This is in the normal situation. The background to this actually is that fairly recently, about 2 years ago, I started teaching preclinical medicine. And the result of it was I went back to the books, and one of the subjects which I was teaching last year was heart. And so we deal with things like the pharmacology, the physiology, anatomy, and so on and so forth. And I had this peculiar pleasure of having, it just the way it happened, the brightest of the medical students, which really put me on full stretch, made me realize I had to know a lot more than what I thought I knew. And the result was I had quite an in-depth look at it. And I have to say that one of the advantages of looking at it when you're an older person is you tend to see the wood rather than the trees. And when I was looking at various aspects of it, this is literally true, I was sitting there saying, do you know, that deserves a design award. That is just so clever. That is just so neat. And this is what I'd like to bring to you tonight. I'm bringing 4 aspects which really made me sit up and say, I really cannot buy that this is chance. It just fits so too well together. And I'm dealing with fairly large, superficial things because